Why do we need conversations about constitutional law and constitutional reform? In this short speech, I will not deal much with constitutional reform, but more with constitutional law. Sri Lanka, like most countries in the Commonwealth, is a common law country. The common law countries are distinguished by their reliance on judicial precedents and judge-made law, which evolved through case-by-case reasoning rather than comprehensive codification. This tradition emphasizes flexibility, judicial independence, and the adversarial process. In common law countries, the legal community therefore has a vital duty to critique judicial decisions, as precedent-based systems rely on ongoing scrutiny to ensure fairness, coherence, and legitimacy. Without critique, judge-made law risks stagnation, bias, whether institutional, personal, or doctrinal, or detachment from evolving social values. A critique is a structured, analytical evaluation of a work, idea, or situation that highlights both strengths and weaknesses, aiming to provide constructive insights rather than mere fault finding. It differs from simple criticism by being more formal, balanced, and evidence-based. Critique ensures that precedents are tested, refined, or overturned when they no longer serve justice. It often inspires legislative intervention when judicial precedent proves inadequate. Critiquing judgments trains lawyers to think critically and equips them to argue for doctrinal change. Transparent debate reassures citizens that judicial power is exercised responsibly. Critique allows courts in different common law countries to learn from each other's reasoning. The law is what the last judge said in the last case. It's a pithy way of expressing a feature of common law, that the law develops through judicial precedent, and the most recent authoritative decision ordinarily represents the current law. There is no such thing as settled law. What appears settled remains so until a later judgment unsettles it. An example would be helpful from India. The makers of the Indian Constitution debated whether the exception to the protection of life and liberty should be limited to a procedure established by law, meaning leaving it to Parliament, or to due process of law. If it was according to procedure established by law, the legislature ought to be trusted not to make bad laws. If it were according to due process of law, the judiciary would have the authority to question a law on the ground that it is not good law and is not in consonance with fundamental principles. The Constitutional Assembly consciously decided on procedure established by law. Soon after the Indian Constitution was adopted, it was argued in A.K. Gopalan versus Madras that the word law in Article 21, which lays down the life, which is related to the protection of life and liberty, meant the principles of natural justice. That law meant principles of natural justice. That argument was rejected by the Supreme Court. But a quarter of a century later, in Maneka Gandhi's case, the Supreme Court, headed by Chief Justice Bhagwati, laid down that any law which deprives a person of his life or personal liberty is invalid unless it prescribes a fair and just procedure for such deprivation. In short, the court read due process into Article 21, despite the Constituent Assembly's conscious decision not to use the phrase. In 1991, at the first SAC Law conference in Colombo, Justice Bhagwati, who had retired by that time, spoke on the Indian developments in public law. At question time, I asked him how he did it in the face of the conscious decision of the Constituent Assembly. His response was that a country must keep pace with modern legal developments and that the people are entitled to benefit from them. A few words about foreign jurisprudence Some in the legal community are reluctant to draw on foreign jurisprudence, viewing it as incompatible with domestic legal traditions or just because they are foreign. Just two examples of how foreign jurisprudence has developed the law in Sri Lanka. In India, the Supreme Court had given an expansive meaning to equal protection of the law by holding that anything that is arbitrary violates equal protection. In Elmo Pereira versus Jayavikrama, Mr. H.L.D. Silva, President's Counsel, strenuously argued for a similar expansion of Article 12. A full bench, divided 6-3, declined, holding that the petitioner had not shown that there was unequal treatment. Justice Vanasundara, in his dissent, held that in the case of a person or in a group, the comparison would be with the norm or protection applicable to the group. In the landmark case of Jayasinghe versus Attorney General, Justice Mark Fernando went further and held that a violation of the norm would be a violation of equal protection, as judicial notice could and should be taken of the fact that the norm is ordinarily followed. That judgment has since been followed consistently. That was made possible because of the original developments in India. As to the actions of state-owned corporations and companies, violative of fundamental rights, our Supreme Court initially took a very restrictive view, especially in Vijayatung versus Insurance Corporation, Chandrasena versus National Paper Corporation, and the 5-member bench case of Vijayaratne versus People's Bank. All three judgments penned by Chief Justice Sarvananda. Justice Sarvananda was supervising my doctoral thesis at that time, and he used to engage me in lengthy conversations discussing my drafts. I expressed my reservations on the correctness of these three judgments, and he was ready to listen. One day he said, read Sukhdev versus Bhagatram, judgment by Justice Matthew. He liked Justice Matthew very much, the judge from Kerala who ended up in the Supreme Court. The judgment supported my line of thinking, and I included it in the draft, noting that our Supreme Court had taken a very narrow view. I remember meeting him on a Sunday and making an oral submission as if I was in court before him. He listened, nodded occasionally, did not say a word. Maybe a couple of months later, I was junior counsel to Mr. Betty Viracon in a fundamental rights case against some corporation, and we appeared for some Samajist trade unionists who had a very strong case. Mr. N.T.S. Kularatne, who taught me local government law at Law College, appeared for the corporation and confidently cited the three judgments of Chief Justice Sarvananda before him. Addressing him, the Chief Justice said, Mr. Kularatne, do you want to proceed with that argument? I have reconsidered this issue and I am prepared to write a judgment. Mr. Kularatne, to my disappointment, backtracked immediately and said, no, my lord. So, we were thus denied of a judgment on an issue. I'm sure a judgment would have been a very lucid one. But very soon, Justice Athukarale in Rajaratnam versus Sri Lanka adopted the views of Justice Matthew in Sukhdev versus Bhagatram, and now it's being followed up to now. A law student from one of the universities interviewed me for an assignment she was working on. She was outspoken and told me that my critiques of judgments seemed measured, temperate, and overtly respectful of courts. She said, sir, you always say, I submit, I respectfully submit, I respectfully disagree, what is this? I explained to her that a critique of a judgment should not become a polemical exercise, as polemics are adversarial, rhetorical attacks aimed at winning arguments, rather than at deepening understanding or improving the law. In the legal community, polemics risk undermining the credibility and constructive purpose of critique. I told her about the example of this, my treatment of Navasivayam vs. Gunodhana, the judgment against Chief Justice Sharmananda, in a case which I had myself had argued. The police officer concerned swore an affidavit to say that he boarded the bus in which the petitioner was travelling, required the petitioner to accompany him to the police station, Girigata police station, for questioning, and released him after recording his statement. The Chief Justice held that it amounted to an arrest, as the petitioner was deprived of his liberty to go where he pleased. I have described that part of the judgment in my book as a watershed in the field of personal liberty in Sri Lanka. But I was critical of another aspect of the same judgment. The petitioner was detained under a detention order under emergency regulations, but fresh orders were not made every month, which I argued made continued detention unlawful. Section 4 of the Public Security Ordinance provides that the expiry or revocation of information shall not affect any offence committed or any right, liberty or penalty acquired or incurred. Chief Justice Sharmananda, referring to Section 4, said that the liability to be detained was a penalty incurred by the petitioner under emergency regulations. I was appalled, and I said this in my draft chapter. By no stretch of imagination could the liability of a person arrested under Regulation 18 to be detained be termed as a penalty incurred. Justice Sharmananda went through the draft, that part of it, did not say a word, but struck off the words by no stretch of imagination with a pencil. So the message was very clear. Be temperate in the use of language. But you are entitled to critique my judgment. So in the book, finally, that part reads, it is respectfully submitted that the liability of a person arrested under Regulation 18 to be detained cannot be termed a penalty incurred. I had learnt a lot. Soon after the judgment, the Public Security Ordinance was amended to provide that fresh orders need not be made each time the emergency is extended. Talking about critique, once when I met Justice Shirani Bandaranayake, she inquired about the progress of the second edition of my book, Fundamental Rights in Sri Lanka, which she knew I was working on. Among other things, I told her that I was critical of the 3 determinations on the freedom of religious propagation she had authored. Her response was, oh, that's all right, as long as you don't call me names. Now, that is the correct spirit. This book is not only about constitutional jurisprudence, but as I said, also on constitutional reform. I hope the reform process will benefit from my contribution. Finally, I want to thank Lake House Printers and Publishers for a job well done. And now that this book is finally out, I want to take a few weeks off my writing and start work on the 4th edition of my book, Fundamental Rights in Sri Lanka. I thank you all again for your honorable presence. Thank you very much.